You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 4th of March 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal, and if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long.
After days of attacking Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership, Donald Trump tries to force the Ukrainian president's hand by halting U.S. military aid to Ukraine. From Kyiv to an economic war closer to home.
As we were ready to do last time, we will have a strong, unequivocal, and proportional response as Canadians expect.
Canada's Justin Trudeau responds to the U.S. introduction of tariffs. We'll also head to Thailand for a look at why Japanese and U.S. embassies are issuing security warnings. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The Trump administration has drawn the consequences from Friday's dust-up with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and suspended American military aid with immediate effect. Those are the reports, at least. The question now becomes whether Ukraine can continue fighting and to what degree Russia will take advantage. Well, I'm joined now by Lily Bivings, business editor for the Kyiv Independent in Kyiv, and by Jenny Mathers, senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Lily, I'll start with you. Just what have the reactions been so far today in Ukraine?
Hi, thanks for having me on. Well, I think understandably so, the reactions are shock, anger, disbelief, although perhaps not surprise that Trump would do something so drastic. And I think just a lot of fear of what's going to happen and of the uncertainty that this brings.
And any response so far that you are understanding, if I could stay with you, Lily, on that so far? Is the Ukrainian government, is Zelensky planning a response to this? What's been happening this morning and afternoon?
Yeah, so there has not been an official response from the Zelensky administration so far, although it seems that they are preparing some sort of response and that he will come out and speak on this sometime today. Supposedly, I think everybody is definitely waiting to hear what he has to say, whether he confirms it, what his plan is or ideas are about what this means, and how Ukraine can maybe even pivot and focus more on its relationship with Europe to fill these gaps. So certainly everybody's kind of just getting reactions from you hear a lot of reactions from the public and from officials about what they feel about this personally and what their worries are about what it means, but an official response or even confirmation has not come yet.
Jenny, listening to that, clearly Ukraine is in something of a state of shock right now. What were your reactions this morning, and how do you think Russia will respond to this?
Well, similarly to the reactions that Lily has described, shock and outrage, but not really surprised, because ever since Trump has been inaugurated, just about 5 or 6 weeks ago, we've heard very consistent anti-Ukrainian statements coming from him, very consistent statements with expressing sympathy for Russia, expressing sympathy for Putin. So it's not a big surprise, even though it is a dramatic step. In terms of Russia's response, we've had certainly responses since Friday from various Russian officials and spokespeople expressing their pleasure that the U.S. is aligning itself more with Russian priorities. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman even said that she thought that Trump and Vance were very restrained and they would have been justified in slapping President Zelensky. So you can tell from that tenor of the remarks that there's a lot of pleasure in Moscow, and they're certainly anticipating being able to take advantage of these steps that Trump is taking.
Lily, even if there is right now sort of this attempt to sort of build a response to this, I do assume at the same time that Ukraine will have been somewhat prepared, at least in the sense that, Ukraine has been building up its own industrial military base in order to boost its own military. Can you tell us maybe a little more about that, how Ukraine would be able to continue fighting even if the U.S. suspends military aid?
Yeah, so actually, we spoke recently. The Kyiv Independent interviewed Rob Lee, who is a military expert, specifically on the war in Ukraine. And he said that actually, over the last year, Ukraine has become a lot less dependent specifically on U.S. weapons. And that's with some localized production, although that hasn't kind of dramatically overtaken the need for foreign supplied weapons. Europe has also stepped in some ways. Of course, you have the wide ranging use of drones on the battlefield that have in some ways, in some areas, replaced large weaponry like artillery and things like that, although not completely, which has changed the game a bit. And Ukraine, as people know now, is very good at producing lots of drones very quickly for use on the battlefield, particularly FPV drones. But, the Russians have gotten quite good at that as well. And I think actually the biggest concern right now is is being able to replace the missiles for Patriot missile systems, which are the air defense systems that protect civilians in cities, specifically in big cities that are far away from the front lines. And that's like the biggest question mark, right? Is how, if the US it refuses to provide those, and if the US even bans Europe from purchasing them from the United States, for example, and providing them to Ukraine, then we're looking at like a really scary situation for specifically civilian deaths, I think. And so that is, I think, the biggest worry on everybody's mind right now, because, and maybe some of your listeners or you yourself know that air defense systems have gotten so good and that there's a regular supply of them to Ukraine that people have been able to live in relative safety and kind of ignore air raid sirens even sometimes and things like that. And so that could drastically change, and the repercussions of that could be enormous.
Jenny, to that point from Lily as well, what kind of response militarily do you expect from Russia to this? Could they take advantage of particularly these, say, gaps in air defense and sort of scale that up? Because at the same time, though, perhaps, Donald Trump is doing this in theory because he wants peace. So I do wonder if Russia is going to take advantage by, boosting its military and it's going for, an even deeper invasion, or whether it might hold fire as well.
Well, I don't think we've seen much restraint from Russia over the past 3 years, to be honest, and I don't think that we're going to see much in the immediate future. All the indications are that Russia is trying to push ahead as much as it can to try and gain, every additional inch of Ukrainian territory under its control against the day when there might be a ceasefire. And I honestly don't see Russia holding back from taking advantage of any perceived gaps or weaknesses that it might see in Ukrainian defenses. So I don't think we should put much hope in that area.
And just to follow up on that, Jenny, do you at the same time expect anything in terms of pressure on Russia? Let's say that Ukraine, comes to the table as a result of this. Might the pressure then grow on Russia to do the same and to suspend? I just wonder what kind of talks we can imagine there might be between Trump and Putin right now.
Well, unfortunately, the thought of Trump and Putin sitting down in the same room together without any other sort of counterweight of national leaders with them is one that really fills me with horror, because everything we've seen so far is that Trump is going to be very obsequious towards Putin. He's already basically offered him everything that Putin already wants, more or less, before even any kind of talks have taken place. So I don't think Russia is under any kind of pressure. Who would Russia be under pressure from? Certainly not from Trump. So I'm not optimistic at all about the future of these kinds of talks, to be honest.
Well, and Lily, just finally then, that does bring us to the Europeans, because if there is this gap from the US, it is one that might be filled with European weapons and military aid. What do you understand from that? Do we imagine there are these kind of talks going on in the background? Is this where Ukraine is now looking?
I think so, yes. I think in recent weeks, Europe has, I would say, finally woken up to the fact that it cannot not only rely on the U.S. as a partner, but as some have argued, even Trump himself maybe relied too heavily on the presence of or the use of American military equipment in Ukraine or in other areas, right? And so I think they've realized that they really have to step up their defense spending. And as far as we understand, those conversations are happening. There are plans being put in place. That's been reported. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, came out today and said that, they have this Rearm Europe plan that's aimed at strengthening defense capabilities in Europe, and that they're going to increase spending and make sure that they're able to continue providing Ukraine, but also beef up their own security. Whether or not Zelensky, I think it's a good question whether or not Zelensky is saying, okay, look, the relationship with the U.S. is totally soured. It's time to just focus on the relationship with Europe. But I think, it seems like that would be logical, maybe, or even maybe, like, in my personal opinion, like, we might as well just do that and kind of forget about the Trump administration, as they, clearly sided with Russia. But I think the Europeans and the Ukrainians understand that a relationship with the U.S., a positive one, is good for long-term security, for long-term prosperity. So there's also this kind of balancing act of, like, okay, the Trump administration is siding with Russia, but we don't want to completely burn that bridge with the United States, because, of course, it's important, and many people in the United States still understand the importance of that transatlantic relationship. So I think it's very tough for Zelensky right now to defend the interests of his people, but also to continue some sort of relationship with the United States, despite how hard it is. So, yeah.
Lily Bivings of the Kyiv Independent and Jenny Mathers of Aberystwyth University, thank you very much for joining us today. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The EU is set to increase defence spending by nearly 800 billion euros. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the funds will strengthen defence capabilities and provide immediate military support for Ukraine following President Donald Trump's decision to pause U.S. military aid to Kyiv. Firefighters in Japan are battling the country's worst wildfire in half a century. The blaze near Ofunatu has killed one person and forced 4,000 to evacuate. It has burned an area larger than New York City's Central Park, fueled by record low rainfall and extreme heat. And the world's leading travel trade show, ITB Berlin, has opened today with a record number of exhibitors. Almost 6,000 companies from more than 150 countries are taking part, up from last year. The event highlights the travel industry's strong recovery with fully booked halls and major focus areas like cruises and travel technology. You can read more about it in tomorrow's Monocle Minute newsletter. Sign up at monocle.com. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Over the course of yesterday, there had been some speculation that tariffs against Canada and Mexico would be eased by the U.S. before entering into force today. Those expectations proved unfounded and have sent global markets tumbling. Canada now does plan to respond, and joining us for more is Monocle's Toronto correspondent Thomas Lewis, as well as Jody Keane, Senior Research Associate at ODI Global in London. Thanks to both of you for coming on. Thomas, I'll start with you. Was Canada really ready for this, or were they perhaps still hoping for some kind of deal?
Well, they were certainly hoping for some kind of deal, Chris. And over the past month or so, the month in which President Trump had postponed the original date for these tariffs on all exports from Canada and Mexico into the United States, they really have been spending all of their time, the Canadian ambassador in Washington, for example, Prime Minister Trudeau, his cabinet ministers, trying to really change the president's mind and, try and articulate the point to elected members of Congress, for example, or other lawmakers right across the US, just how damaging to their own economies in states across the United States would be if these levies go ahead. Now, I think it was interesting to hear yesterday and over the past few days that cabinet members in the Canadian government really had no idea until the 11th hour yesterday when President Trump gave this confirmation that these tariffs were going ahead. They'd said that in the past, when these kind of tariffs had been suggested or put in place, that they had been given fair warning internally by the US government that they were in fact going to go ahead on the date that had been agreed to. So they hadn't had any of that kind of notification, despite what they would argue having met all of the demands that US President had put on them in order for him to change course on putting these tariffs in place, Chris.
Jody, to bring you in here, I mean, is this frankly the new reality now? Tariffs, at one point were seen as perhaps a threat that would not be enacted. They are now being enacted. Do we have to sort of just accept this new version of events?
Well, I think in the case of the European Union, we're still waiting to see what Trump will do. Macron obviously visited Donald Trump very recently and came back, there was some optimism that the meeting went well. Macron had kind of warned, he mentioned that he's warned about the risks of starting a trade war with China and the European Union at the same time. But obviously, the developments that have been announced this morning are obviously deeply concerning. And Trump has previously said that duties could be applied on the European Union from the 12th of March. So I think we still have a little bit of time to go. I think probably commission officials are probably waiting with bated breath. I know that lots of arguments are being made, to kind of convey to the USTR, to Trump's advisors, that whilst there's a deficit in terms of trade in goods, there's actually a surplus in relation to trade in services. So just to really convey the nuances, when you look at trade deficits and so on, just to probe a little bit more carefully and deeply into the statistics. And the Commission is ready, to respond. It has kind of new instruments in place that it can use, and it can cover these instruments can cover areas like investment, kind of cover this services, investment, IP nexus, which is all connected to global value chains. So I think, if officials can keep on in this diplomacy line, just to convey just how damaging this really would if we have the economies that account for, substantial, kind of third of global trade, this could just be really, really damaging indeed.
Well, we are joined now also by Monocle's editorial director and chairman, Tyler Brûlé, joins us from Toronto to discuss this as well. Tyler, great to have you on the show. You are in Toronto. Your thoughts, perhaps, on the news today. Was there some hope from you that we would not be going down this road?
Good afternoon, Chris. Well, I have to say, if you listen to any of the Canadian news outlets, almost right up until midnight last night, there was this almost sense that would there be this small window? Was there some type of dealing going on between Ottawa and Washington, and would this be saved? But of course, the narrative was that the doors on the Trump administration side were certainly slammed shut, and there was going to be absolutely no discussion. And now, of course, Toronto and Canada is waking up to the reality of what this means. A lot of people being canvassed, of course, when you listen to the likes of the CBC, other outlets in Canada, trying to get a sense of the mood of the country. And I have to say, it is remarkable being back here. Chris, I was in Toronto, of course, a few months ago, but I'm even just standing outside. I'm in an area of Toronto, Kingsway, and Old Mill. So this is a very nice part of West Toronto. If you would have been here a few months ago, you would have seen a lot of Ukrainian flags. It's a very Ukrainian, very Polish part of the city. Those Ukrainian flags are still around. You could say actually maybe more than ever, but just the sheer amount of Canadian flags in windows. I've just seen a pickup truck go by, another vehicle, all with Canadian flags fluttering. And this real narrative now, which is coming out of here, which is, of course, what is going to happen, anything from maybe the more polite Canadian approach to now this morning you're hearing more discussion about the nuclear option, not just delivered by Ottawa, but also delivered by the provinces as well.
Tyler, to stick with you on this, I mean, you describe the mood there, the Canadian flags. One thing we haven't touched on perhaps is Canadian businesses, and I am curious either before this or now, what kind of contacts you might have there. How do businesses think about this? Is it only a negative, or is there also maybe this sort of opportunity for Canada in building its own brand as a result of this? Because there is very much this sort of made in Canada movement right now.
There is, and of course, you can hear from restaurants who say they're not going to be using ingredients from the United States until things change. So you have this, maybe not looking at big corporate Canada first, Chris, but certainly this mood at street level from small businesses. They also want to say this is what we want to do to fight back, that this trade war makes absolutely no sense. But there is this galvanizing force. You have to remember that, of course, we're in the midst of a leadership race for the Liberal Party. Of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is going to be exiting. We'll see this weekend who becomes the new leader of the Liberal Party, and also Prime Minister, of course. Very much an election on the horizon here as well. So it's also put Canadians in a bit of a feisty mood, but there's also this real sort of sense of unease as well. Of course, we saw Trudeau, of course, fly across the Atlantic to the defense and overall Ukraine talks in London on Sunday. So you have this sort of maybe sort of rallying this, I wouldn't say sort of rush into the arms of Europe, but maybe more of a feeling that actually Canada's future is not only going to be certainly south of the border, but we have to look across the Atlantic. We have to look more across the Pacific. Of course, this has always been happening, but when you have a big, comfortable friend south of the border, things become very easy. So, yeah, we're always trying to sort of look for opportunities in times of crisis. But this is certainly a wake-up call for this country as well. And there's this, amazing sense of rallying behind the flag, which I haven't seen for some time.
Jody of ODI Global, if I could just bring you in on that finally, because listening to Tyler there about how Canada's responding, I do wonder if we'll have the similar kind of response in Europe. Are we going to see now a sort of, made in Europe movement, a sort of bravado about that in the same way that we're seeing in Canada?
Yes, I very much hope that the Europeans remain committed to an open trading, global trading regime, committed to the multilateral trading system. And there have been some proposals that have been put forward, saying that the Commission should bring together, countries that are affected by the tariffs into the WTO to start a conversation about how to respond, in a way that doesn't, completely undermine the global trading system. I mean, when you look through the Trade Policy 2025 document that's on the USTR website, when I read through it, I really do have a lot of sympathy in terms of what the policy is trying to achieve, in terms of trying to leverage trade policy to increase the share of manufacturing value added in the United States and so on. But where I think it is really deeply misguided is that it fails to take account of how global value chains are structured. This document may have made more sense, in the 1970s and the 1980s, perhaps, when tariffs could help attract industry. They did indeed attract parts of the automotive industry and so on. But nowadays, within the world of global value chains, this is just no longer the reality. And I think that the policy, seems to be using tariffs on the one hand as a kind of taxation, revenue collecting mechanism. On the other hand, to tackle illegal immigration and the spread of drugs and so on. So I think personally, any contribution that can really assist countries in thinking through how to design more effective industrial policy within, a world of highly globalized value chains. This could be a really, really useful conversation for like-minded countries to champion. I think, most of the Western world has struggled with the rise of China. The neoliberal experiment, the Washington consensus, is well and truly dead. But the Western economies, many Western economies, are trying to find, what really can go in its place. What can they do to turn around their economies and, address the failures of previous policies?
Tyler, just to bring you in one last time, if you're still there, I do wonder if you also think that, there will be a narrowing of supply chains in Europe and in Canada, for that matter, or a sort of rallying together in favor of free trade and sort of more of a global response to trade as a result of this.
Chris, I think it's very difficult. I was just thinking about, a very famous Canadian brand, not quite as big as it used to be, but, Bombardier famously brought their C-Series jet to market. This is an aircraft that many of us are flying around on all the time. That production line was subsequently bought up by Airbus, but all of the manufacturing is outside of Montreal. But you think about the global supply chain, the sheer amount of American suppliers, the sheer amount of European suppliers, Japanese suppliers that go into this. And here's an aircraft, which is selling incredibly well in the United States. You think about how is all of this going to be unraveled, and to what gains really come from the end, because this is just a classic example of a global product made in Canada, but depends on the entire world, of course, to get the wings, the tail, the fuselage put together, and of course sitting just 1 hour from the U.S. border. So very complicated times ahead of us.
Tyler Brûlé and Thomas Lewis in Toronto, Jody Keane of ODI in London. Thank you all for joining us here on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing. You are back with The Briefing, and we'll head across the world now to news from Thailand, where U.S. and Japanese embassies have issued security warnings. And this is amid fears of possible responses to the deportation of Uyghurs who had fled to Thailand being deported back to China. The deportations themselves have also been condemned by the U.S. Secretary of State. And joining us now is Thitinan Pongsudhirak, a professor of political science and international relations at Chulalongkorn University. Thitinan, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us, perhaps to set the scene for this, why Uyghurs have been fleeing to Thailand, when they started coming, and what the mood has been with them arriving there in the first place.
Several hundred Uyghurs sought refuge in Thailand 11 years ago, and they've been here all this time. Some of them were already deported back. Back in 2015, Thailand had a military government which catered to the Chinese government. So those Uyghurs were deported, and there were some reports of abuses and mistreatment. But the remaining Uyghurs, now 40 of them, have been sent back forcefully. And the conditions of their deportation were actually appalling, because it took place in the dark of night. It was very secretive. The roads were closed. The Chinese sent an airplane over to take them back. And it just had all the handiwork of a repressive kind of maneuver. So for Thailand, this is really an unnecessary move. I think it's really a strategic blunder, because you have, the U.S. has not been talking about Thailand under the second Trump administration, except Marco Rubio. He mentioned in the confirmation hearing that Thailand should not be sending Uyghurs back because, they would be abused and certainly mistreated. And this is something that he hopes that Thailand will not do as a U.S. treaty ally. But now it has happened, and Secretary Rubio has condemned Thailand, and this means that U.S.-Thai relations will not start off on a sound and smooth footing.
As you
at
mentioned,
the same time.
As you mentioned there, perhaps just to jump in quickly, do you think that Thailand had a choice in this because of the way you're laying this out? On the one hand, Marco Rubio has condemned it, but at the same time, of course, China is involved here. Might they have forced this move and forced Thailand's hand?
Certainly, China has pressured Thailand. If you look at the sequence of the time, Marco Rubio says about the Uyghurs back about mid-January, the Thai Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra visited Beijing on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Thai-Chinese relations in early February. So I think this is a small remote shot across the bow in U.S.-China confrontation. The Chinese put pressure on Thailand after having heard that Uyghurs were important to the Americans, and Thailand got caught in the middle. And I think that the Thai government made the wrong move by siding with China, sending these Uyghurs back in violation of international law and even Thai law. So this is something that made Thailand leaning closer to China unnecessarily at a time when the U.S. is on the offensive on trade and technology and on a range of other issues.
And Titinan, when it comes to these security warnings from the embassies as well, how severe is that in your mind? I mean, what do you expect Thailand to be doing now? Are they preparing for some kind of attack, which also did, frankly, happen back in 2015?
The US and the Japanese embassies are being prudent. In 2015, after those more than 100 Uyghurs were deported, shortly after there was a major bomb incident in the middle of Bangkok, and it claimed a score of lives, and something like this could happen again. There's some risks that the Uyghurs now may take some retaliation, and their embassies and the US and Japan are being extra cautious, cannot blame them. And this is another reason Thailand did this and incurred a lot of risks, made a move to get closer to China and antagonize the Americans. I just think it was a blunder.
Well, and just on that point, finally, Titinan, I mean, the fact that Thailand's in a very difficult position here, is it not? It also relies so much on tourism, frankly, both from the West, but also from China itself. I just wonder, is there some other way that you think they could have managed this?
There's no doubt that we need tourism. I mean, the economy is sagging and stagnating. And in 2019, we had almost 40 million tourists, and 1/4 of them came from China. And the pattern is the same last year and probably this year. So certainly China is the biggest economic partner for Thailand. Traditionally, the U.S. played the role of the offshore balancer for security for Thailand and also for Southeast Asia. I think, navigating this, reliance on China as an economic partner and the U.S. as a security provider is a tricky kind of navigation. And Thailand needs to be nifty in doing so. Also, other Southeast Asian countries. But by doing this Uyghur maneuver in favor of China, I'm not sure that will stand Thailand in good stead in this navigation.
Titinan Poksutairak in Bangkok, thank you very much for joining us. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAviney and Ryuma Takahashi. Our researcher was Francisca Jilks and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.